120 words per minute for 10 minutes. 5 seconds more. Start. Global warming and climate change are two terms for the observed rise in the average temperature of the Earth's climate system and its related effects. Multiple lines of scientific evidence show that the climate system is warming. In 2014, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Fifth Assessment Report concluded that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. The largest human influence has been emission of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Climate model projections summarized in the report indicated that during the 21st century, the global surface temperature is likely to rise a further 0.3 to 1.7 degrees Celsius for their lowest emissions scenario and 2.6 to 4.8 degrees Celsius for the highest emissions scenario. Future climate change and associated impacts will differ from region to region around the globe. Anticipated effects include warming global temperature, rising sea levels, changing precipitation, and expansion of deserts in the subtropics. Warming is expected to be greater over land than over the oceans and greatest in the Arctic, with the continuing retreat of glaciers, permafrost, and sea ice. Other likely changes include more frequent extreme weather events including heat waves, droughts, heavy rainfall with floods, and heavy snowfall, and extinction of species due to shifting temperature regimes. Effects significant to humans include the threat to food security from decreasing crop yields and the abandonment of populated areas due to rising sea levels. Many of these effects will not only exist for decades or centuries, but will persist for tens of thousands of years. Possible societal responses to global warming include mitigation by emissions reduction, adaptation to its effects, building systems resilient to its effects, and possible future climate engineering. Most countries are parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, whose ultimate objective is to prevent dangerous anthropogenic climate change. 16 of the 17 warmest years on record have occurred since 2000. While record-breaking years attract considerable public interest, individual years are less significant than the overall trend. In particular, ocean oscillations such as these can cause temperatures of a given year to be abnormally warm or cold for reasons unrelated to the overall trend of climate change in the world. Global dimming, a gradual reduction in the amount of global direct irradiance at the Earth's surface, was observed from 1961 until at least 1990. Solid and liquid particles known as aerosols produced by volcanoes and human-made pollutants are thought to be the main cause of this dimming. They exert a cooling effect by increasing the reflection of incoming sunlight. Since 1978, solar irradiance has been measured by satellites. These measurements indicate that the sun's radiative output has not increased during that time, and hence the warming during the past 40 years cannot be attributed to an increase in solar energy reaching the Earth. Climate models have been used to examine the role of the sun in recent climate change felt in the world. Models are unable to reproduce the rapid warming observed in recent decades when they only take into account variations in solar output and volcanic activity. Models are, however, able to simulate the observed 20th century changes in temperature when they include all of the most important external forcings, including human influences and natural forcings. the tilt of the Earth's axis and the shape of its orbit around the Sun vary slowly over tens of thousands of years. This changes climate by changing the seasonal and latitudinal distribution of incoming solar energy at Earth's surface. During the last few thousand years, this phenomenon contributed to a slow cooling trend at high altitudes of the northern hemisphere during summer, a trend that was reversed by greenhouse gas induced warming during the 20th century. Anthropogenic forcing has likely contributed to some of the observed changes, including sea level rise, changes in climate extremes such as the number of warm and cold days, declines in Arctic sea ice extent, glacier retreat, and greening of the Sahara. During the 21st century, glaciers and snow cover are projected to continue their widespread retreat. Projections of declines in Arctic sea ice vary. Recent projections suggest that Arctic summers could be ice-free as early as 2025-2030. Changes in regional climate are expected to include greater warming over land, with most warming at high northern latitudes and least warming over the Southern Ocean and parts of the North Atlantic Ocean. Overall, it is expected that climate change will result in the extinction of many species and reduced diversity of ecosystems. Mitigation of climate change are actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or enhance the capacity of carbon sinks to absorb greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. There is a large potential for future reductions in emissions by a combination of activities including energy conservation and increased energy efficiency, the use of low carbon energy technologies such as renewable energy, nuclear energy, and carbon capture and storage, and enhancing carbon sinks through reforestation and preventing deforestation. A 2015 report by Citibank concluded that transitioning to a low-carbon economy would yield positive return on investments. Most countries in the world are parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The ultimate objective of the convention is to prevent dangerous human interference of the climate system. As stated in the convention, this requires that greenhouse gas concentrations are stabilized in the atmosphere at a level where ecosystems can adapt naturally to climate change, food production is not threatened, and economic development can proceed in a sustainable fashion. The Framework Convention was agreed in 1992, but since then global emissions have risen. During negotiations, the G77, a lobbying group in the United Nations representing 133 developing nations, pushed for a mandate requiring developed countries to take the lead in reducing their emissions. This was justified on the basis that the developed world's emissions had contributed most to the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Per capita emissions, that is, emissions per head of population, were still relatively low in developing countries, and the emissions of developing countries would grow to meet their development needs. This mandate was sustained in the Kyoto Protocol to the Framework Convention, which entered into legal effect in 2005. In ratifying the Kyoto Protocol, most developed countries accepted legally binding commitments to limit their emissions. These first-round commitments expired in 2012. United States President George W. Bush rejected the treaty on the basis that it exempts 80% of the world, including major population centers such as China and India, from compliance and would cause serious serious harm to the US economy. At the 15th United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change of the parties held in 2009 at Copenhagen, several United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change parties produced the Copenhagen Accord. Parties associated with the accord aim to limit the future increase in global mean temperature to below 2 degrees Celsius. The 16th Conference of the Parties was held in 2010. It produced an agreement, not a binding treaty, that the parties should take urgent action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to meet a goal of limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. It also recognized the need to consider strengthening the goal to a global average rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius.